Good morning and welcome to the Morning Report. My name is Willie Lawson. One of the advantages of getting older is that you've had an opportunity to see a lot of things. One of the disadvantages of getting older is that you've had the opportunity to see a lot of things. So when you've been around long enough, you start developing a sense of when somebody is giving you a real explanation or when somebody is just lying to you, giving you an excuse. Now, sometimes you can't immediately prove they're wrong. And sometimes you don't even know exactly what's wrong with what they're saying, but something in the back of your mind, your spidey sense is tingling, right? That starts flashing like a warning light on the dashboard. Something just don't add up. Okay, I've spent better part of 40 years around technology. Not just talking about technology, not writing about articles on technology, working around it, watching it evolve, watching problems that once seemed impossible become routine, watching businesses figure out how to process more information faster, more accurately, and with fewer people than ever before. I've watched the banking industry transform. I've watched communications transform and logistics transform. I watched companies figure out how to track products moving across oceans and continents in real time. I've watched computers go from being these giant machines that occupied entire rooms to something that we carry around in our pockets and complain about because it takes 3 seconds too long to load a web page. Now, maybe that's why I'm reacting a little differently when somebody tells me that counting ballots in a major American city takes 2 weeks. Maybe that's not my first response isn't political. Maybe that's why my first response is, can you help me understand that? Because I spent, again, most of my adult life listening to people explain why something couldn't be done right up until that second that somebody figured out how to do it. Okay. That's one of the reasons I've been thinking about California lately. Not just because California is blue or just because California is run by Democrats. Not just because California is the favorite villain and deservedly so of conservative media. No, I've been thinking about California because every election cycle we seem to have the same conversation. Election day comes and goes. Most of the countries get results. Florida gets results. Texas, states all over the country get results. And then we hear that California is still counting, still processing, still verifying and working through ballots. And somehow we are expected to believe that this is simply the normal cost of conducting elections in a modern society. Now, here's where some people immediately jump off the rails. The second that you question that explanation, they assume you're making some larger accusation. They assume that you're claiming fraud, or you're claiming election theft, or you're claiming that you possess some evidence that nobody else has seen. But that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is much simpler. I'm saying that after 40 years of watching technology solve increasingly complicated problems, I find it damn near impossible to accept that the best we can do is spend days or weeks determining who won an election. And before somebody tells me that California is different, let's talk about Florida for a minute. Because Florida isn't Wyoming or North Dakota. And it's not Rhode Island, some tiny state with a handful of voters and a couple of precincts. Florida is one of the largest states in the country. Millions of people vote here. Millions. We have major metropolitan areas, Orlando, Miami, Tampa to some degree. We've got absentee ballots out the waz. We have early voting. We have retirees. We have military voters. We have seasonal residents. We have every kind of complexity you can imagine. Yet, somehow, Florida manages to count ballots and report results in a way that most voters understand and most voters accept. That's what keeps bringing me back to the same question. Not because I have an answer, because I don't. At least not yet. But I keep coming back to the same question. If Florida can do this, why can't California? And the more I hear explanations, the more I find myself unconvinced by them. Not because they're impossible, not because not because they're irrational, because every explanation seems to stop right before the part that actually matters. Every explanation tells me why California does what California does. Very few explanations tell me why California must do it that way when apparently Florida doesn't. And that's where the trust enters the conversation. And I think it's the part that way too many politicians and elected officials and members of the media completely misunderstand. Trust is not something that can be demanded. Trust is not something that can be ordered into existence. Trust is not something that people owe institutions simply because those institutions exist. Trust is earned, and it's earned through competence. It's earned through transparency. And when people ask reasonable questions and receive answers that make sense, and when those answers stop making sense, trust begins to erode. I think that's why when we're watching, when we're happening now, I don't think most Americans spend their evenings reading election law. I don't think so. I don't think most Americans are experts in ballot processing, or most Americans understand every detail of election administration. However, what they do understand is comparison. They understand looking at one state and then looking at another state. They understand seeing one place produce results quickly and another place producing results slowly. They understand seeing one set of officials say something is possible while another set of officials act as it isn't. And when people observe these differences, they naturally begin asking questions. The mistake being made by a lot of public officials today, they are assuming that questions themselves are the problem. Remember COVID, right? I don't think they are. I think unanswered questions are the problem. I think explanations that fail to persuade are the problem. Treating skepticism as some kind of moral failure is a problem. Because once people start believing that their concerns are being dismissed rather than addressed, suspicion grows. That's human nature. It happens in business, in personal relationships, in government, and it certainly happens in elections. And that's why this whole recent SAVE Act debate caught my attention, not because the legislation itself is the entire story, but it reminds me how many Americans are searching for something that seems to be increasingly in short supply of. Confidence. Confidence that the process is fair, that the rules make sense, that the people running the system are willing to answer hard questions. Confidence that when two states approach the same problem in dramatically different ways, somebody can explain why one method produces results overnight and the other produces results weeks and weeks later. Because if nobody can explain that in a way that makes sense to the ordinary voter, then we should be surprised when trust continues to decline. And maybe the part that bothers me the most, not the disagreement or the politics or even the election itself. What bothers me is how often people asking the questions are treated as though they're the problem. Somewhere along the line, we seem to have adopted the idea that confidence can be restored by criticizing the people who lack confidence. I don't know anybody who operates this way in real life. If your customers stop trusting your business, you don't just call your customers names. See, does that work? If members stop trusting their church, you don't solve the problem by mocking the congregation. If shareholders stop trusting management, management doesn't regain credibility by lecturing the shareholders, does it? Yet, when it comes to elections, there seems to be a belief among some officials that commentators that skepticism itself is a threat rather than asking why the skepticism exists in the first place. And the reason I keep coming back to Florida is because Florida removes a lot of excuses from the conversation. If California were being compared to a tiny state with a fraction of the population, that would be one thing. If California was being compared to a state with almost no absentee voting, that again would be another thing. But Florida isn't some theoretical example. Florida is real. Florida conducts large, complicated elections. Florida processes millions of ballots. Florida deals with all the same human realities that every other state deals with. Human beings make mistakes. Address changes, voters move, signatures vary, ballots arrive close to deadlines, and somehow the system manages to produce results that most people can understand. Whether you like the outcome or not, most Floridians go to bed on election night with a pretty good idea of what happened. Now, think about what matters. It means that something along the way, or somewhere along the way, people sat down and designed a process intended to deliver timely results. Now, it didn't happen by accident. It happened because policymakers decided that the finality mattered and knowing who won mattered and public confidence mattered. They decided that election officials should be, that election officials should be able to prepare for election day before that election day arrives. Now that might sound obvious. Thank you, Captain Obvious. But apparently this isn't obvious everywhere. In some places, the process seems to be designed around continuing the process. The election arrives, and then the counting continues, and then the verifications continue, and then the curing continues, and then the updates continue. Then the public is told to be patient while the outcome remains uncertain. Now, the funny thing is that people that people defending these systems often act as the public's frustration is irrational. I don't think it's irrational at all. Imagine a football game going with the scoreboard operator announced that the final score would be available sometime next week. Imagine a business telling investors that quarterly earnings will be released eventually. Once all the numbers were reviewed again and again and again, imagine a bank telling customers that the account balances might fluctuate for several days while transactions were finalized. Nobody would accept that. Nobody would call concerns unreasonable. Yet somehow, when elections are involved, citizens are expected to suppress the very instincts that guide them in every other area of life. This is where I think my background in technology colors the way I see the world. Because for decades, I watched organizations identify bottlenecks and eliminate them. I watched people automate tasks that once required armies of workers. We were watching a show the other night, and we were watching The Price is Right, and somebody asked what this person did, and he said he was a computer operator. And my wife and I both said, well, that's a job that doesn't exist anymore. Computer operator, data processing clerk. Or you walk into an office and there was a room full of data processing clerks. Well, that job doesn't exist anymore. Because that's what innovators say. They don't hear something takes too long and immediately conclude it must always take that long. They start asking questions. What causes the delay? Why does the delay exist? Can the delay be reduced? Can it be eliminated? What are others doing differently? And that's how progress happens. Which is why I find it fascinating that some election officials almost seem offended by those questions. If your system requires 2 weeks to produce results, why wouldn't you welcome the opportunity to explain why? Why wouldn't you be eager to demonstrate why the delay is necessary? Why wouldn't you compare your procedure to those of other states and show why your approach is superior? Instead, too often the response sounds defensive. The response sounds irritated. The response sounds as though the very act of comparison is somehow inappropriate. But comparison is exactly how people evaluate performance. It's how business competes. It's how schools improve. It's how sports teams measure success. It's how governments are supposed to be held accountable. And that, of course, brings us back to what? Trust. Trust is not built when people are told to stop comparing. Trust is built when comparisons strengthen confidence. If California's system is truly the gold standard, then officials should be able to explain why. They should be able to explain why their process takes longer and why that additional time produces a better outcome. They should be able to explain why Florida's approach would be inferior. They should be able to explain, to be able to make the case. The fact that so many Americans remain unconvinced suggests that case either isn't being made effectively or isn't heard effectively. Now, let's talk about suspicion for a second, because this is where the conversation usually becomes uncomfortable. I think a lot of people hear the word suspicion and immediately assume bad faith. I don't necessarily. Suspicion is often what happens when observations and explanation fail to line up. You notice something, you hear an explanation. The explanation doesn't seem to fit what you are observing. So you continue asking questions. That doesn't make you paranoid, it makes you human. Every one of us does this every day. We do it in our personal relationships, in business, in our communities. We do it wherever reality appears inconsistent with the story that we're being told. That doesn't mean every suspicion is correct. No, far from it. Humans can be wrong. We can misinterpret events. We can jump to conclusions. We can also allow biases to influence our judgment. All of that is true. They emerge from observations, experiences, and unanswered questions. So when millions of people begin expressing similar concerns, dismissing them outright may not be the wisest strategy. Sometimes the better strategy is figuring out why those concerns exist in the first place. One of the things that strikes me about this entire debate is how much it resembles the other trust failures that we've seen in recent years. Whether we're talking about government agencies or media organizations, public health authorities, financial institutions, or corporations, the pattern often looks the same. The institution says, trust us. Members of the public ask questions. The institution becomes defensive. The public becomes more skeptical. The institution responds by demanding even more trust. The cycle continues until confidence deteriorates further. At some point, somebody's got to break the cycle. And the burden usually falls on the institution because the institution is the one seeking the public confidence. That's why I think the SAVE Act debate resonates with so many different people beyond the specifics of the legislation itself. For supporters, the issue isn't simply citizenship verification. The issue is confidence. They look at a country where trust in elections has been declining for years and ask why additional safeguards are considered controversial. Whether one agrees with their conclusion or not, the question itself reflects a deeper concern. People want confidence, they want clarity, they want systems that appear secure and trustworthy. And when they don't feel that confidence, they begin looking for ways to restore it. The danger, of course, is that once trust is lost, it's difficult to recover. That's true for governments, just like it is for individuals. If a friend lies to you once, rebuilding trust takes time. If a company disappoints customers repeatedly, rebuilding trust takes time. If an institution develops a reputation for opacity, opacity or inconsistency, rebuilding trust takes time. There's no shortcut. There's no public relations campaign that magically restores credibility. Trust is rebuilt through performance, through transparency, through accountability, through demonstrating that concerns are taken seriously rather than dismissed. And that's why I keep returning to what I think is the critical issue. The question isn't whether every concern about elections is justified. The question is whether the people responsible for elections understand how many Americans have lost confidence in the process. Because if they don't understand that, then they are unlikely to solve it. If they believe the problem is simply misinformation, they will focus on correcting information. If they believe the problem is simply politics, then they'll focus on politics. But if the information is trust, then the institution has to involve trust. Maybe that's what makes Florida comparison so important. Florida provides a real world example that citizens can see with their own eyes. It demonstrates that a large state can produce millions of ballots and provide timely results. Whether Florida's model is perfect, it's really not the point. The point is that Florida exists. Florida proves that there are more than one way to run elections. Florida proves that lengthy counting periods are not an unavoidable law of nature. And once people understand that, they naturally begin asking whether other states could do things differently if they wanted to. And that's not a radical question. That's not even a partisan question. It's a practical question. If one approach produces greater public confidence, shouldn't we at least examine it? Shouldn't we at least compare it? Shouldn't we at least ask whether some of its strengths can be applied elsewhere? Those seem like reasonable questions to me. And yet too often they are treated as though asking them is somehow dangerous. Now, the opposite is true too. I think refusing to ask them is dangerous. I think refusing to examine differences is dangerous. I think refusing to acknowledge declining confidence is dangerous. Because eventually a republic demands and depends upon the citizens believing that the institutions around them deserve their trust. Not blind trust, but earned trust. The kind of trust that survives scrutiny. The kind of trust that grows stronger when the questions are asked rather than weaker. Because at the end of the day, I don't think most Americans are looking for perfection. I don't think they're expecting miracles. I think that they are looking for explanations that make sense. They're looking for transparency. They're looking for accountability. And they're looking for evidence that the people running those systems understand why confidence matters. And they're looking for leaders who are willing to engage hard questions instead of treating those questions as threats. And that's why this conversation matters. What we're talking about here is bigger than California. It's bigger than Florida. It's bigger than the SAVE Act. It's about whether our institutions still understand that trust must be earned. Because if they don't, then the trust deficit we are seeing today may only continue to grow tomorrow. And that would be the problem for every American, regardless of party, regardless of ideology, and regardless of who happens to win the next election. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We'll see you when we see you. Bye bye now.